for a ton fee?
What's too much?
Yeah.
Well, there's no such, I mean, there's no number that's a magic number, okay? But I think that obviously from a seller standpoint, you ask for too much, you're going to discourage people from wanting to buy your house, right? Because or enter into contracts with you. So I think you have to be cognizant of that. And the other thing is, you know, I get a little bit concerned. There are some laws that say, I mean, for example, the FHA mandatory clause, the VA escape clause, the Homeowners Association Act, that say that if the buyer cancels, I mean, in the case of the 2 loan programs, if the appraisal comes in low, in the case of HOA or COA, condo associations, if they see something in the disclosure documents they don't like, they get to walk away with no penalty. We want to make very clear the TOM fee is not a penalty, and that's part of the reason we don't credit it at closing, because that's another question that kept coming up with the TOM fee is why don't we credit it at closing like we do earnest money? We don't want it to be tied to the transaction closing, because then it might be considered a penalty in the event that it doesn't close. And these loan programs don't allow the buyer to suffer any penalties in the event that they walk away because the appraisal comes in lower, because the disclosure certificate, they found something on that they don't like. So we want to keep those very separate. There's no number, and we're not the only state to use this, believe it or not. Texas uses it. And they've been using it forever. North or South Carolina use it, and they can get really high, especially in some of the commercial deals. They can get to very high numbers. What we kind of recommend here in the state is somewhere between $150 and $500 for a TOM fee, depending on the property value and you know how those kind of things, how long it's going to be off the market, those kind of So those are the kind of numbers we're thinking are going to happen. But there's nothing that says it can't be higher, can't be lower. There's nothing that says any of that. Those are, you just have to keep in mind. If I ask for a $2,000 TOM fee and it's not getting credited back at closing, how many buyers are going to write offers on my property, right? So.
Is there a deadline for how long, like, you know, like two weeks
for
the TOM fee?
Oh, well, we anticipate it's the beginning of the transaction. Within 3 days, they're going to deliver TOM fee, if that's what you're talking about, like when the buyer would deliver it. We envision it like earnest money, only you're not doing earnest money, you're doing TOM fee within the first 3 days. You're doing earnest money once you get past the resolution date of inspections, you know, or if there's no objections, then after the objection deadline.
Okay, so you do the TOM fee first and then earnest money?
Yeah, exactly, yeah, and you'll see all those options in the contract, that earnest money will be deposited within 3 days of date of acceptance, or within 3 days of the objection deadline if there are no objections, or 3 days within resolution deadline if there are no resolutions. So the idea being is that you're going to get through that whole inspection period before people start depositing earnest money. If things go south after that, there is earnest money sitting at the title company, but a lot of deals tank over inspections. And if we can get through that period without having to just, you know, get into earnest money disputes, then we're doing well. You know, we're mitigating. We're not eliminating earnest money disputes, but we're definitely mitigating. Also, we have in paragraph 47, we talk about acceptance. Just some, you know, this is from a legal standpoint. You know, we don't want people thinking that you can somehow accept a contract by just performing on it. If you don't actually sign it, you don't have a contract, because there is case law that talks about, you know, parties have come to an agreement, but it hasn't been signed off on, but one party is just performing along like there's a contract. So we make it clear that there actually has to be something in writing and signed by the parties. Buyer sale contingency. You guys love this form, don't you? I know you don't love this form. You don't have to lie to me. I know you don't love this form. But it's because you don't understand this form. If you understood this form, you would have such great appreciation for it. So I just want to run through it really fast, because if you guys know this form, again, you are so far ahead of the game. So far ahead of the game. So many brokers out there just don't get this form. And it really is a great form. And I don't just say that because I wrote it, but it's a good form. So the buyer sale contingency is being used when the buyer has to sell their property, right? And it's not yet under contract, all right? If it's already under contract, then you're using the closing and funding contingency. It's a different form, okay? It's the 2503A. But if it's not under contract yet, you're using the buyer's contingency. Now, you can create a buyer's contingency in the purchase agreement, can't you? So if you're working with a buyer and you put in there that there's a buyer sale contingency, you check that box in the purchase agreement. You don't attach 2503 at all, right? You try to push that date as far out as you can, so you can give your buyer as much time as possible to get their property sold and closed and funded, right? You created the contingency for your buyer. And that actually works just fine from a buyer's perspective. This form is so insanely seller friendly. So if you are working as a listing broker and you get a contract with a buyer sale contingency that does not have 2503, you have got to be countering with 2503. And the reason you got to counter is because it does all these great things for a seller. Number one, it allows the seller to actively market their property until the buyer notifies them that their property's gone under contract. And so you can keep active, I mean, MLSs, we kind of have to have discussions with MLSs about this, but you can continue to do exactly as you were doing as far as marketing the property. And then what happens if the seller gets another offer in? What do they get to do? They get to go to the buyer and say, hey, you've got 48 hours, 72 hours, whatever time frame I've given you in the contract, or we've agreed to in the contract, to satisfy or waive the contingency. And if you can't, then I'm moving on to the second buyer. What does it mean to satisfy the contingency? Does it mean the buyer has to get their property under contract? No.
Means they have to have closed and
It
funded.
means they have to close and fund it. She's been in mine. It means you have to close and fund it. You have to get under contract, you've got to close it, you've got to fund it. Is that going to happen in 48 hours?
No.
Not likely, right? So what are they going to be left with? What can they do? All they can do is waive it, right? The other thing that's wonderful, and it's important because this right here tells you what satisfaction means, because everybody thinks satisfaction means the buyer's property is under contract. Under contract, closed, funded. Not going to happen. So you have waiving, and the other thing this form does is, in the event that they do waive, and the seller says, you know, last week you told me you had to sell your property to buy mine, and this week you're saying you don't need to sell your property to buy mine, and I'm not sure I feel good about that. So I've checked this box right here, or these initialed right here in this paragraph, and it allows the seller to review the buyer's financials to make a determination if they feel warm and fuzzy about this waiver. And if they don't feel warm and fuzzy about the waiver, they can say, I'm not accepting your waiver. It's totally in the seller's court. I'm not going to accept your waiver. I don't think you can perform on this contract. You said you couldn't, now you say you can. I don't trust what I'm looking at is really means you can perform. And then the seller can move on to the other person. Yes?
So that would leave it open, say the other offer that the seller got was much better,
Mm-hmm.
then the seller could say they don't.
That they don't trust it. Yeah, now, you remember that they're inherent in every contract is the covenant of good faith and fair dealing, right? The idea is that we're not all trying to get out of the contract. We're trying to make it happen. We're trying to perform. So if a seller was being sleazy and the financials were clear that this buyer could buy, you know, it was in a gray area, then, and they denied it because they had a better offer in the wings, that would be challengeable, Carrie. That would absolutely be challengeable. If it was gray area, it's the seller's discretion, right? Or if it's not clear they can, you know, if it shows they can't do it, the seller has every right to say no. But if it's absolutely clear from the financials that they can perform, and then they decide not to and take this other offer, that will definitely be challenging.
Is that part determined just by the lender?
The what?
Like that part of that gray area, is that determined by the lender?
No, it's up to the seller. I mean, when the seller gets whatever documentation they get from the buyer and they're reviewing it, whether it be bank statements or it might be a letter, a lender might have sent a letter over that says they can perform, they can buy your house without having to sell their own house. That a lot of times that is the proof. Then that's that's the kind of documentation that the seller is looking at. So that's the kind of documentation, bank statements or letters from lenders that the buyer is going to need to say, yeah, I can still perform even if I don't sell my property. Yeah. Yes.
So on the form, if once they get their house under contract, so do you do anything with the form because they're not satisfying or waiving it because they haven't closed, but they're just actively progressing towards it?
Right, exactly. So once they get their property under contract, the seller is required to stop actively marketing the property. They can still accept backup offers, but they can no longer kick the first buyer out with 48 or 72 hours or whatever it is in their notice, okay? They have to stop. We've added a section, which I'll talk about in just a second, which is how do you notify them? And we do have in the new buyer seller contingency form, whether they want a text or whether they want an email or whether they want, how they want to be notified. Hey, my property is under contract. And that is the clock, that is the race, guys. Buyer to notify seller before seller gets another offer in. And it's amazing how often these things happen, like right at the same time. And then it comes down to, well, who notified who first? Did you tell me you got another offer in before I told you I got my house under contract? Or did I get that over to you before you told me? Because that's what it comes down to in these situations, right? So at that point, they can no longer do anything but take up backup offers. They cannot actively market the property. But we have a whole section in here in the event that the buyer's property falls out of contract. So in the event they go under contract and then that deal falls apart, right? They do a couple of inspections, decide they don't want to buy it, it terminates. The buyer has an obligation to notify the seller that the property is no longer under contract, and guess what the seller gets to do? Gets to actively market their property again. That 48 hours comes back into play. The whole thing starts over again. Okay? If you are using this form, you will never move to another form. You will never have to go to 2503, for example, A, when the property goes under contract. This is the only form that you're going to need. It takes care of all of it. There is a date by which the contingency has to be satisfied or waived. If it's not satisfied or waived by that date, then the contract terminates. So, you know, obviously if you're a buyer, you're pushing that as far out as possible, right? I need as much time as I can to get my property closed and funded and sold and everything else. So I want that as far out as possible, close to the date that I'm gonna have to close on this other property. We have representations where they say it's under contract, you know, it's being marketed, it's in the MLS or it's not, it's with a broker or it's not. We talk about any notices, how notices will be made. We talked about waiver in the financials and how those are, and we talked about time frame for performance. Let me talk about this for a minute because we also deal with it in a new form we just released. What does this mean, time frame for performance? If you have a contract with a buyer sale contingency, you guys are under contract. The buyer's under contract, the seller's under contract, you're under contract. But when are we gonna start performing on this contract? Are we gonna start performing right away, or are we gonna start doing, remember, buyer's property is not even under contract yet, right? They haven't even got it under contract. Are we gonna start doing inspections right away? Are we gonna deposit earnest money right away? This is that paragraph that deals with that, guys. And what it says is, we have it broken down into earnest money, and we have it broken down into time periods for other performance. So maybe in a buyer sale contingency situation, the seller wants earnest money right up front, right? They're signing a contract, everybody's obligated, we want earnest money pretty quickly. However, maybe we don't want to start inspections until the buyer's property's gone under contract, right? Or maybe we don't want to start inspections until the contingency has been satisfied or waived. So you get to push some of those deadlines back in the contract. So you're not creating a lot of expense when we haven't even got the property under contract. What buyer's going to want to spend a lot of money on inspections when any minute another buyer could come on the scene, and with 48 hours notice they could get kicked out of the whole thing, right? So they probably want to wait at least until their property gets under contract and the seller's no longer actively marketing the property, right? So that's what this is.
Since the buyer would have, let's say the seller, at some point the buyer would have to waive the contingency, and or depending upon how things go, their house might go under contract.
Right.
Can you check 2 of those boxes?
Two of these boxes?
Yeah, like the date that buyer delivers written notice, or the date that the buyer delivers written notice. You know what I mean?
That has been satisfied or waived?
Depending, because it could go either way.
Let me just see how that would work. So let's say earnest money. Date that the buyer delivers written notice that the buyer's property has gone under contract, the date the buyer delivers written notice that this contingency has been satisfied or waived, or other. So I guess it would be what, the sooner of those two
Right.
things? Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it would probably go under the other, and you'd have to write in there the sooner of those two things. Yeah, because I mean, maybe you want either the date they waive it or the date it goes under contract, whichever should occur first. So, but you'd have to write that in the other, because right now you only have options for ors, not,
Right.
you know.
Ands.
Yeah, right.
So when it says that, the deadlines, as per the purchase agreement,
Yeah.
can they ever try to come back and combat the fact that in the purchase agreement, you have, you know, earnest money in 5 days from date of acceptance?
Right.
Because they have the date of acceptance
Right.
in there. Does this supersede that, saying the date of acceptance is per this paragraph?
Yeah, so you guys didn't watch my videos because they came out yesterday and not a lot of you guys got them, but I talk about this particular provision, not in the context of the 2503, but in the context of our backup contract that we just released, a new backup contract. I talk about this in great detail, so you should take a look at that, but of course I'll answer the question. Yes, your answer, it does supersede. It's an addendum that changes the date of acceptance. So I actually talk about this, and I actually talk about it in the form, the backup contract form, that I really explain it a lot in the actual form. So in the contract where you say 3 days from date of acceptance, if you're using this addendum, you're saying 3 days from the date the buyer delivers notice that this contingency has been satisfied or waived, or 3 days from the date that the buyer's property goes under contract. You're replacing the date of acceptance letter for the date of acceptance language with this language here.
Okay, good, 'cause I was doing an addendum to make sure that that was clarified. and I
Yes,
wanted to make
yes,
sure. Okay.
yeah, and that's what timeframes for performance means. It's like, because under our contract, we have 3 days, when do we have to perform? When do I have to deliver my earnest money? 3 days from date of acceptance, right? That's a time frame for performance, right? We're modifying the time frame for performance to whatever this says in this paragraph. And the same is true for our new backup contract. Yeah. But we don't break it down in the backup contract, but here you can break it down between earnest money and other time frames for performance. And then this is the seller's notification to satisfy or waive the contingency in the event that they get another offer in. TikTok, time to start doing something. You've got 48 hours, 72 hours. Buyer's notification that I am satisfied or waiving. And if you waive it and then you can't close on this property, then you are in breach of contract, buyer. That's what this paragraph tells the buyer, okay? And then like I talked about, the approval of the buyer's financial qualifications. If you guys initialed those, and if you're working for a seller, you're initialing those and you're wanting to see financials. So moving on to another form that we recently changed a little bit, we removed the other section from 4C of the ORW. So 4C on the ORW is strictly for use when you're doing a seller concession or price reduction. And the idea, the way you're supposed to use the form is in the event that you mark the box, you're supposed to abandon the ORW and move to the amendment. Okay, so you say, I'm not going to do all these things, but I'll give the buyer price reduction of $5,000. You abandon the ORW, you go to the amendment that we reference in there, you do the $5,000 reduction, you send it over. If they don't like it, they tear that up and they create their own amendment and they send it back over to you for a $6,000 credit at closing or price reduction. And you guys keep going back and forth like that until you come to an amendment that you guys can agree upon. Okay, that's the idea. The other has been removed from that section. HOA forms, as you guys know, a bunch of changes to the HOA Act that took effect on July 1st. They're not supposed to be charging you guys up front for disclosure certificates. They can't charge you any more than $300. If two of the items in the disclosure certificate, which are strictly about how much the seller owes to the HOA, if those things change, they're only good for 60 days, and if they change and you have to go back for updated information, it's only $50 to update that information. So I've been dealing a lot with the title companies because I know you guys rely heavily on the title companies to get these docs for you, and we've been kind of going round and round with some of the big management companies that don't seem to, well, I think they're all on board now, but if you guys come across an HOA who's not aware of all of these new rules, you should give me a call. I'm happy to make a phone call for you. On 5106 is a new form. It's our revocation of offer or counteroffer form. I did a whole MR voice, which is actually also, there's a link to it in the email that went out yesterday that you guys should read, okay? Because this goes back to what I was saying before. You guys are transaction brokers. You guys are all very clear that you can't accept an offer for your clients. You can't reject offers for your clients, right? You